So welcome again. We talked last time about functionalism, and now I want to add a little something to examples. I already mentioned them last time, or one of them, but I want to make it a little more clear. And then we will talk about behaviorism, and we will contrast behaviorism and functionalism. I think it's always easier to understand these theories if you compare them with each other, and then you can more easily see how they are separate from each other and where they overlap and so on, right? So this we will do now. So you remember last time we talked about implementation independence, and I gave you this example of lecture notes, but I didn't have slides for it, so now here are the slides if you want to read also. So lecture notes are the same lecture notes, no matter whether they are written by hand on paper, whether they're printed out or read aloud in class or presented in a video like here, right? Here are my lecture notes on this slide. So these are the same lecture notes that you might get printed out. They are not different lecture notes, although they are presented in a different way, right? The lecture notes are a functional concept that is independent of its physical realization. You don't call something lecture notes only because it's printed. Many printed things are not lecture notes, right? Many books are not lecture notes. Or because it's projected on a wall, right? Not all things that are projected on a wall are lecture notes. And you can also not say that lecture notes must be projected on a wall. This is not true, right? Lecture notes can come in all sorts of ways. The physical realization, the physical form of the lecture notes is not essential for their being lecture notes. Lecture notes are defined as lecture notes by the functional relations they have to lectures, universities, a student's career, examinations, class readings, other class work, and so on. So you call something lecture notes if it is given to you by your teacher, and it contains in a written form, or not even necessarily written, it contains in some form that you can review the information that was presented during a lecture, right? And then this thing is a lecture notes. And this can be a video, it can be an audio file, it can be a book, it can be all kinds of things. As long as it does this thing, it's lecture notes. So every piece of information that has the same functional relations will be considered lecture notes, no matter how it is delivered physically as an audio file, a book, or a movie. And the same might be true of the mind, right? A mind could be something that has, or a mental state could be something that has particular relations to, like we said, other mental states and the world, no matter how it is implemented in a physical way. Therefore, often, the most common example that we know of functionalism, and that is most accessible to every modern person, is the distinction between hardware and software. In computing, right? The same kind of software, for example, a web browser, can run on totally different hardware. All these web browsers are functionally equivalent, whether you use Firefox or Chrome or the Internet Explorer. They are more or less functionally equivalent, although they are meant by different companies. They are built in different ways. If you look at the code, it's totally differently organized. They run on different and incompatible hardware. Some of these programs run only on Windows. Some are run only on desktop computers that run Linux. Some run only on Macs, like Safari. Some run only on your phone, which is again a totally different computing platform on your tablet. Some run on big screens, some run on wall projectors, some run on little phone screens. But they're all functionally the same. You can, with all of them, go to your university's homepage, and you will see your university's homepage, and you will get the same content, the same information, the same pictures, even similar layouts, right? Depending on the size of the screen, it might differ a little, but roughly you will get the same kind of information. So all these web browsers do the same. Their functional role in the economy of your computing activities is the same. You use a web browser to access a web page and to read it. And as long as it accesses a web page and makes it possible for you to read it, it's a web browser. Even perhaps if it doesn't have any screen. You can imagine a web browser for the blind that just shows the web page content on a braille output, or reads that reads the page to the viewer, right, to the audience. And in this would be a web browser that doesn't even have a screen, right? It's still a web browser. If you can get it to read an internet page to me, then it's a web browser, okay? So this is the best metaphor of how a functionalist would see the mind. So you could imagine the mind to be something like the software of the brain. And if this was the case, then the same mind could be run on different brains in the same way like you can run a web browser on different hardware. Also, it would be possible to run the mind on a computer with entirely different hardware from the brain's hardware. And this is why functionalism is so popular among AI circles, because it's the easiest way to understand the mind in a way that would make it actually possible to implement a mind on a computer. Because if you say the mind is brain states, then you can forget about AI. If you say the mind is a dualist kind of soul, again you can forget about AI, because we don't know the magic of creating a soul. But if we say functionalism is just states that connect to other states in particular ways and can be implemented in different physical ways, then I can actually have hope of implementing a mind on a computer. It doesn't mean that I can do it immediately, but at least there is in theory the possibility of achieving that at some point, right? While with the other theories it's much more difficult to imagine achieving that. Okay, so these are two examples of how you can understand this idea of physical realizability and implementation independence. Okay, so now let us go on and compare functionalism. This we talked about already last time. Compare functionalism to behaviorism. So mental states are behaviors. Behaviorism would say mental states are behaviors. They're just another way of talking about behaviors. In this way, behaviorism is different from functionalism. Functionalism says mental states are states that are connected to other states of the body, of the mind, of the environment, and have these functional relations to other states, interactions. While behaviorism would say mental states are behaviors. Behaviorism doesn't care about states of mind. Behaviorism ideally wouldn't look at all at what is inside the behaving agent. I have, you see me sitting here, I'm behaving in a particular way. As long as I'm behaving in a way that looks intelligent, you would perhaps say this man is intelligent. Or, as long as I behave in a way that looks like a human, then you would say, or let's say alive, then you would say this man is alive. If I'm just lying there on the floor and I have the behavior of somebody who's dead, you would say perhaps he's dead. So this is behaviorism. You don't try to judge whether the person has a mind or intelligence or life by opening them up, by looking inside, by trying to describe their states. No, you don't do these things. You only judge the properties of a thing by its behavior. And now if you think about it, what does this remind you of? Where have we met a famous behaviorist argument in the philosophy of AI? We talked about this a lot in the past, right? Can you see it? Think about it for a moment. The Turing test, right? The Turing test is such a behaviorist argument. Turing says, how can we determine whether a computer is intelligent? We don't need to open it up. We don't need to look inside. We don't need to map its possible states. The only thing we have to do is to talk to it, and even talk to it through a chat interface so that we see only the behavior without being influenced by the structural form of it. And if the behavior is similar to the behavior of a reference system that is known to be intelligent, then the computer is intelligent. Right? So the mental states are nothing but behaviors, you can say. This is a very sharp way of putting it. But it is actually what behaviorism wants. The mental states are behaviors. So if someone is in fear, right, then this is equivalent to saying that he will be exhibiting the behaviors of hiding or running away or sweating or having faster heartbeat and so on. His fear is identical to these behaviors. If he doesn't have the behaviors, then he doesn't have proper fear. Being soluble is an analogy to one's a Caribbean holiday. Or the other way around, once a Caribbean holiday is an analogy to being soluble. These are operational definitions. If I put X in water, it will dissolve. This is what it means for something to be soluble. There is no other meaning to it. It's a behavioral definition. Something is soluble if it shows the behavior of dissolving in water. If someone wants a Caribbean holiday, this is, again, defined. They can define this as a particular behavior. You do particular things if you want a Caribbean holiday. You buy, a ticket. You buy all kinds of books about travel books about the Caribbean. You look at websites about the Caribbean. If you do these things, then you want a Caribbean holiday. If you don't do these things, then you don't want it. No matter what you say, you can say, I want a Caribbean holiday, but I don't care to look up on the net, what the Caribbean is. So then you're not actually having this state, right? You only have this state if you actually, perform the actions, the behavior that belong to this state, okay? So this would be behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is tempting in a way, and is tempting because, again, particularly for AI people, it's tempting because it means that I can have mental states just by exhibiting a particular behavior. I don't need to be made of brain substance. I don't need to be made of cells. Anything that has a behavior has a mind. And we use this a lot in everyday life. Our everyday understanding, of things is often behavioral. You would judge a car, not necessarily by how the car is built inside or what kinds of states it has. There are cars that are electric. There are cars that are driven by petrol engines. There are big cars and small cars and SUVs, and there are buses, and there are trucks. So all these kinds of cars are different. We recognize them all as cars, and actually we don't care. If I say, I want a lift from the university back to my home, I wouldn't care what kind of car realizes that lift, right? As long as the behavior of the car is what I expect as a behaviorist, my car to exhibit. It, goes along the street, it doesn't crash, it stops, lets me get in, and then it stops, lets me get out. Then this car fulfills the criteria for a car. So in an everyday life, we are behaviorists often. Or when we judge other people, right? Imagine you look at another person, you look at your friend, you look at your family. How do you know that these people have a mind, right? Look at me now. How do you know that I have a mind? Have you ever looked inside my brain? Have you seen what mental states I have and if these states relate to other states and so on? Do you know whether I actually see anything or whether I see things in the environment that cause me to be afraid when I feel like I'm afraid, or when I talk here, I exhibit some mental states. Do I exhibit any mental states? Do you see any mental states? You don't see any mental states. What do you see when you look at me? You see behavior. You see somebody who is sitting there talking, moving his hands around. This is what you see, okay? And therefore, your whole perception of me is the perception of behavior. And if you attribute mind to me, if I ask you now, do you think that I have a mind? Do you think that I have mental states? And you say probably yes, because it would be kind of crazy to say no. So everybody would say yes spontaneously to such a question. Well, yeah, how do you know that I have mental states? And the only way you know is through my behavior. Does this thing have mental states? No, probably. This doesn't have mental states. Why doesn't it have mental states? Because it doesn't behave like it did. It doesn't talk or dance. It doesn't do these things. It just sits there. So it doesn't seem to have mental states. Okay? Its behavior is not a behavior that lets me conclude that it has mental states, right? So behaviorism is an everyday attitude. When I look at a tree, does a tree feel pain? It doesn't seem to, because it doesn't behave as if it feels pain. It might actually, nobody knows, but we don't assume that it does, because it doesn't behave that way. Does a dog feel pain? Yes, but how do you know? You don't know actually if a dog feels pain. You only see that, if the dog has some pain, it behaves like you would behave when you have pain. It drags its leg, or it, starts making crazy noises, and from this, my dog is in pain. So, again, you are a behaviorist, right? Spontaneously, without thinking about it, we tend to be behaviorists. And this is why behaviorism is tempting, and also, behaviorism is even more independent of physical realization than functionalism. Because functionalism at least looks into the states of the thing and says, does it have the appropriate states and the appropriate connections? Behaviorism doesn't look at anything except the behavior. The Turing test doesn't look at all. How are these programs structured? How are they made? What states do they have? Do they, can they possibly think or not? The Turing test looks only at the question, does this thing in the end talk like a human? If it does, it's intelligent. Finish. Right? So behaviorism makes it easy, in a way, for AI to be attributed with all sorts of mental states. Because as long as the program can create the behavior, it's good enough. Now, can you give an example where you can clearly see how functionalism is different from behaviorism? Think for a moment. Try to make up an example where you can see that the functional evaluation of a system and the behavioral evaluation are clearly different, where they don't agree. Okay. Breitenberg vehicles, for example. Breitenberg vehicles, you remember we talked about them in the past. These are very good examples on which you can distinguish behaviorism from functionalism. Because the behaviorist would say, if the vehicle behaves as if it feared the light, then it fears the light. There is no sensible definition of fear for the behaviorist beyond what can be expressed in the vehicle's behavior. So when Breitenberg himself said these things, which we thought of as being exaggerated or a little bit crazy, when he said these things, that the vehicles are afraid or love the light or have an attraction to the light or are aggressive, all these things, Breitenberg, when he says these things, is clearly behaviorist. The vehicle has this behavior, therefore it has the state. But normally, most people would perhaps not agree, especially if you know how the Breitenberg vehicle is constructed. If you don't know, if it's a black box, you might be tempted to assume that there is some supercomputer in there, very small, that can simulate all these states and can have all these feelings. But if I know what is inside, and I know it's just, 2 sensors and 2 motors and 2 cables, then we perhaps would tend to be functionalist and say that fear is a state that is caused by other mental states, like a belief that something is dangerous, and in turn it causes other mental or bodily states, the belief that running away will avoid the danger and so on, and the vehicle doesn't have all these states, and therefore the vehicle doesn't qualify to be a carrier, of the mental state of fear. So the Breitenberg vehicle fulfills the conditions for behaviorist fear, but it does not have the mental and body states required for genuine functionalist fear. It just does not have any beliefs or other mental states that would qualify as functional equivalents of our mental states that accompany fear. In the same way, the Turing test, if you take a program like Alice, what we saw, this AIML bots, this thing for a behaviorist can be intelligent if it passes a Turing test, because the behaviorist doesn't care how it's made. The functionalist would care how it's made. The functionalist would look at Alice and say, this is not intelligence. Even if it can deceive the user, it's not intelligent because it lacks the internal states that are required. Just taking a piece of text and matching it with a database and outputting another piece of text is not a proper functional state that connects to other states in the same way like our intelligent conversational behavior connects to other behaviors and beliefs that we have. So the Chinese room is a functionalist's counter-argument to the behaviorist argument of the Turing test. Right? This is a nice thing to understand and a nice sentence to remember. The Turing test is a behaviorist test, a behaviorist argument. If something behaves conversationally as if it was a human, then or as if it was intelligent, which means the same because we know only humans as reference systems for intelligence, then it is intelligent. And now Searle comes along and says, no, this is a behavioral definition, but this is not enough, because if we look at how these things are made, for example with AIML, with Alice, we see that the way they are made, it does not qualify them to be attributed intelligence, and therefore as a functionalist, Searle is a functionalist, in this point he would say that you can clearly see in the Chinese room that the Chinese room lacks the functional structure that would be required for genuine intelligence. And therefore, no matter what behavior it has, Searle accepts that the behavior might be perfect. It might be fully intelligent. This is the premise of the Chinese room. But although the behavior is fully intelligent, the Chinese room is still not intelligent because Searle is a functionalist. And for a functionalist, behavioral definitions of intelligence are not enough because the mental states, the functional states, are missing. Okay? So another way how you can understand the difference between functionalism and behaviorism is to see actors on a stage playing, right? You have a theater and you have people playing a role. And so now one actor kills the other with a sword, and the other actor falls down on the stage and is lying there and performs being dead, right? And a behaviorist would watch them act, fear or dying, and conclude that they have a mental state of fear or that they are indeed dead. But, and now comes the functionalist criticism, this is a criticism of behaviorism from the side of functionalism. The functionalist critic would say, obviously this is wrong. The actor is not afraid. He's just acting the fear. He is not dead. He's just acting dead. And tomorrow night he will be again alive and playing the same piece. So the behaviorist gets it wrong, the functionalist would say. And we can show this with the example of a theater, because although the actors have the correct behavioral expressions, they lack the functional states that would really qualify their fear as fear or their death as death. The functionalist would notice that the supposed mental state of fear is not related in an appropriate way to other mental states. They don't forget their lines, for instance. If somebody was afraid, he would run out of the theater. These people don't run out of the theater. They keep talking. They stand there, right? They don't have the correct functional states for fear. They don't have the desire to flee. They don't have the belief that they are in danger. Therefore, they cannot be in a mental state of fear, even if they behaviorally simulate fear. Okay, so now let's briefly summarize this. Arguments against behaviorism. Behaviorism denies the inner aspect of mental states. For example, pain. Behaviorism would say it doesn't matter what your inner states are. We don't care. We are behaviorists. The only thing that counts is your behavior. If you have the correct behavior, you have the mental state. Behaviors can be faked, what we just saw, actors on a stage or in a movie. Mental states can be present, but not express themselves in behavior. So this is again an argument against behaviorism, is the opposite of the stage argument. You could have a mental state, but not express it in behavior. Right? I could be in fear, but paralyzed by fear, unable to scream, unable to run away. Then I would look perhaps like I feel perfectly well, but I would be in terrible fear. Right? Again, the behaviorism does not give us a way to describe that, because it doesn't distinguish between behavior and actual inner state. Still, in the form of the symbolic AI and the Turing test, behaviorism is a powerful idea in the history of AI. It's now we know that it's not such a good idea, and the Turing test generally is not anymore thought to be so relevant for actual AI. But it has been traditionally very important, and in public consciousness and public imagination, the Turing test is one of the things that almost everybody knows who has even a very superficial acquaintance with AI and philosophy of AI. And therefore we need to be aware, and our default setting in everyday situations is often to be behaviorists. And so we should be aware of these differences and see our own behaviorism or the historical behaviorism of AI with a critical eye. And perhaps instead, we should embrace functionalism, go away from behaviorism, as the most promising philosophy of mind, theory of mind, for AI. And we don't necessarily need to make a statement about the brain in the same moment, right? It is difficult to decide whether our actual brains, whether our mind is a dualist thing, a physicalist thing, an identity theory thing, a functionalist thing, a behaviorist thing. The mind is complex. We don't understand it. And for many centuries, people believed in exclusively almost in God and a soul that is given by God and going away from the body after death. We cannot deny this. We might, think that perhaps it's implausible or perhaps it does not go well with other scientific beliefs we have. But this in itself is not a reason to assume that that is false, right? So we really have to be agnostic about what the mind is. Our mind, a human mind. But we can perhaps distinguish this from the question how to make a computer that exhibits mind-like states. Right? Perhaps the way out of this problem is to not talk about a mind in a computer, but to talk about mind-like states. And then already you have a functionalist description, right? Mind-like states. You have states, and if they behave like the mind does, then they're good enough. And this opens the way to create computers that have mind-like properties without having to decide the question of how the human brain is constructed or what the human mind really is about. I think connecting these things is a bad recipe for successful AI, because if you stop the AI project until we have clarified what the human soul is, then probably we will never get to have AI. So we need to dissociate the philosophical question of the existence of a soul or a mind-body problem and dualism and monism and so on from the technological project that is to create AI. And if we create AI that is functionally good enough, then it doesn't matter what happens in our brains. This is not the point, right? The point of AI is not to understand our brain. If I was a theologian, yes, then it's a crucial question, do I have a soul or not? If I am a cognitive scientist, a brain, scientist, then yes, it's an important question to me. Does the brain contain a soul or not? But if I'm an AI researcher, who cares, right? The brain is a different thing. It's not AI. AI is computers. And if computers can have a mind, then this mind will be something different necessarily from a human mind. And for the moment, we don't need to connect these things. There are places in the future, and this we will talk about later in this course, where these again converge. So, for example, now I make a computer, I make a robot, I functionally simulate, mental functions on it, and make a quasi, functionalist mind, that now a mind, let's say in quotes, that this computer has. And now this computer has, in quotes, pain and in quotes, fear, because of the job it has to do, some dangerous job for us. It's a robot, right? We send it to clean up in Fukushima. Now this thing has pain and fear. And now I get into trouble because I seem to have a concept of human rights that everything that has a mind, which as far as we knew until now is only humans, everything that has a mind has perhaps a dignity, if I believe in Kant. And if now the computer has all these mental states in quotes, but they look very similar to our mental states, at some point it will be difficult to say that this should not have dignity, although we have dignity, if I justify the dignity and the rights through these mental states. Right? You understand? So if I say I have rights because I have fear and I have freedom and autonomy, and now the robot seems to have fear and freedom and autonomy in quotes, how important are the quotes then, right? If the quotes are not so important, then perhaps the robot's fear and hope and so on are genuine fear and hope, good enough for the functionalist, but then the robot can claim human rights, right? And if the robot claims human rights, then again we are in trouble, because then we cannot use the robot as we would like to use it. You don't want to have a robot that claims human rights. The whole point of creating robots is to create slaves that we can use where we don't want to put humans in danger, right? It's all difficult, but very important. This is why, although this is a class on AI in society, you have to talk about philosophy of mind. We cannot pretend that this discussion does not exist. And if a technologist, engineer or something, creates a robot and says, I don't care about the philosophy of mind, this is stupid. This is, short-sighted. Because the philosophy of mind is always there. Because our ethics is based on a theory of mind. Most of our ethics, most of our human rights are based on some concepts from the theory of mind. We believe that our minds are of a kind that justifies rights for us. And then we need to understand what is this and how is it different from what machines have, right? Okay, so let's stop here in this discussion of functionalism, behaviorism, and human rights. We will come back to the human rights later when we talk about applications of AI. For the moment, that's enough. See you in the next video.